Well, every year in Manchester, Tennessee, there's a music festival that's called the Bonnaroo Music Festival. I'm not much of a music festival kind of guy. It actually sounds like a pretty terrible idea to me. But maybe that my only experience with music festival was serving my kids. Were on a team or in a club, and there was a fundraiser deal where the parents, this is another terrible idea, but the parents had to go do the fundraiser, and Sherry and I helped with security at this music festival, and my job was to guard these porta potties all day long. So I had to tell people these are very special porta potties. You have to have a ticket to use these. You can just not for ordinary people in these porta potties, and so maybe that colored my music festival experience. I don't know. But evidently, lots of folks do love these kinds of events because somewhere between 70 and 90,000 people will show up for the Bonnaroo Music Festival on this 700-acre ranch in Tennessee. So just a huge event. I read about this music festival with an author who wrote an article, and he had gone to this festival to hang out with a group who call themselves the Soberoos. And this is a group of recovering alcoholics who hang out, they camp together at this music festival, they attend together because they want to, have all the fun at the music festival, but remain sober over those 4 days. And just an atmosphere and environment where there is plenty of alcohol being consumed and all kinds of other drugs and whatnot. And so their goal is just to be together to stay sober. And so this author tracked with this group, and he's a recovering alcoholic himself, so he wanted to see what that looked like, how this group stood out from those around him. He wrote at the end of his article a description of what motivated him, he said, to stay sober that week. He said, 2 drunken kids are staggering around the vendor tents like just debarked seamen. They are mumbling nonsense to one another that will elude their memories later. What were we even talking about, man? They'll surely be asking one another in a few days. Weirdly, it's my annoyance with these kids that ends up preserving my sobriety. He went there expecting one group to stand out, and I guess another group of folks stood out to him on that occasion. It just reminded me that I think most of us want to stand out in life for something. We want to be recognized in some way. We want to stand out for something. I suppose the real trick is deciding what is worth standing out for. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open them to Matthew chapter 26. We're going to take a look at a beautiful story in just a few verses. Starting in about verse 6, we'll work our way through verse 13. I would just really love for us to think about this story together. It's a story that takes place when Jesus had just been in hot water. The temperature was pretty high in all reality, and it would just increase as this last week of Jesus' life would go on. He would be in more and more hot water. But there was plenty of sort of concern about from the religious leaders around Jesus even at this time. It started at the very beginning of his ministry, maybe even before that. I remember a story in the Gospel of Luke, one of the only occasions we have of Jesus' childhood. He's 12 years old. His parents take him to the temple for a festival. They're in the temple. Mary and Joseph head home with the rest of the caravan back to Nazareth. They forget Jesus. I'm not sure as parents if you want that on your resume for any child, but when it's the Son of God, anyway, they forget Jesus. They think he's with one of the others, and they leave, and then they realize we don't have Jesus. They go back to the temple. They find Jesus interacting, essentially teaching the Pharisees, the rabbis, the religious leaders in that setting, just going back and forth, discussing all things theological. We tend to look at that interaction and think of it in this positive way. I just try to put myself in the sandals of those religious leaders, these learned men who have studied their entire lives to be able to answer these deep theological questions. Here's a 12-year-old brat. I wonder if the hot water started to increase in temperature even then. For sure, when John the Baptist begins to lead the way for others to learn about Jesus, John the Baptist is preaching in the wilderness. He's baptizing people in the wilderness. He's attracting such a following that pretty soon the Pharisees and other religious leaders head out to the wilderness to see what this is all about. And John the Baptist is there telling folks that, hey, somebody is coming after me whose sandals I'm not worthy to carry. You need to pay attention to this. I'm not the Messiah, but he's on his way. Be on the lookout. And as these religious leaders show up, he refers to them and says, I don't know who invited you, brood of vipers. The temperature in the water was just rising. Well, Jesus, all through his ministry, he taught and he preached. He said things that caused that temperature to rise. Whether it was healing people on the Sabbath or refusing to follow rules that the religious leaders had, maybe washing of hands or fasting at the appropriate times, Jesus did things all through his ministry that caused the temperature of that hot water to be on the rise with religious leaders. He's in Bethany, this town that is super important to Jesus. He's previously been in Bethany on several occasions, but most recently he was at the home of his friend Lazarus. Lazarus, his friend, had died. Jesus waited several days before he shows up to visit Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters. And then he walks to that tomb and he stares into that dark tomb and he says, Lazarus, come out. And you know what happened? Lazarus obeyed. Jesus raises him from the dead. Can you imagine? We're still singing about it this morning, that there is one person, that there is one God with the power to raise the dead. This is front page news, folks. And so at this time, man, that word is spreading and people are so excited. And as Jesus' fame for those kinds of miracles is on the rise, so is the temperature of that water. As he heads into Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, eventually we know he'll go to the cross at the end of this week. But before he gets there, he stops in that favorite town of his, Bethany. This time not at Mary and Martha's house, but at the house of this guy named Simon. Everybody in the New Testament seemed to have a nickname. They had their first name and then something to kind of separate them, to help them stand out from the crowd. And for poor Simon, he was known as Simon the leper. And it's at this house that Jesus now resides. Look at verse 6 here in Matthew chapter 26. It says simply, now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. Well, Bethany really is this important place to Jesus. He had visited several times before. There's this great story of Jesus visiting Mary and Martha and Lazarus. We see the sisters busy. Martha is busy preparing a meal and serving all of their guests in their home as Mary sits at the feet of Jesus listening. And there's you can imagine, I suppose, a little squabble between the sisters, and Jesus just encourages Martha that Mary's, man, she's chosen correctly, that this is your opportunity to be with me. Of course, just most recently, Jesus had gone to rescue, to raise from the dead his friend Lazarus after he passed away. And so that story was on everybody's heart and mind, even on this occasion as they sat in Simon the leper's house with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, this guy who had just recently been dead, to enjoy a dinner party. Of course, Jesus will ascend into heaven in that same town. It's super important to Jesus. He loves being there. And here he is at this house, and all we know is that it belongs to Simon the leper. That's all we know about this guy. The most likely scenario to me that we can paint here is that probably Jesus had some kind of encounter with Simon, who had leprosy, previous to this dinner party, where Jesus most likely healed him. And that would put Simon in the long line of folks who have been transformed by Jesus and then threw a party. The very author of this gospel, Jesus' disciple Matthew, when Jesus called him from his tax collector business and said, "Come follow me," the first thing Matthew does is throw a party for all his tax collector friends to be introduced to Jesus. We know the story about that wee little man, Zacchaeus, who climbs up in a sycamore tree to see Jesus as he's walking through town. And Jesus said, "Hey, come down, Zacchaeus. I'm going to your house today." And what does Zacchaeus do? He throws a party for all of his tax collector friends to meet and know Jesus. Well, here's Simon, who maybe he was just healed the day before. We don't really know. Or perhaps, I think more likely, on one of Jesus' other visits to Bethany to his friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they maybe introduced Jesus, or Jesus encountered Simon and healed him. And now here is Simon throwing a party for Jesus, for all of his friends, perhaps to be introduced or to hang out with Jesus one more time. The step number one here in our story is to make room for Jesus. And certainly Simon is doing that. He's in this long line of guys who have been transformed and now they throw a party. They make room for Jesus in their home. But I suppose just by that name, Simon the leper, and if I'm right, if this is a guy who had leprosy and Jesus healed him and that transformation takes place, then we can't rush past this really big idea here that Jesus makes room for every single one of us on his team to be a part of his family. He makes room for us first. And man, when we are transformed, when we are changed by our relationship with Jesus, then one of the first things we ought to do, just like Matthew, just like Zacchaeus, just like Simon, is make room for Jesus in our home. Right? Make room for Jesus in our heart and in our minds and in our lives. So what does that look like? Well, I think there are simple steps. They're simple steps, but hard steps to take that we talk about often here at Wallula Christian Church. I think it means meeting with Jesus on a daily basis. Carving out time to spend time in His Word and communication and having conversation with Him. To have a growing, meaningful time of study and prayer every day with Jesus. We do things like provide these reading plans. Right now, we have an Easter reading plan out there. Many of you are signed up for that. I'm thankful that you're participating in that. If you want to get started today, just jump in. You can register on the Church Center app. There are a few hard copies of this reading plan on the Next Step station at the back of the room. Grab one of those on your way out. But even if you just take one of those hard copies, I would love for you to sign up on the Church Center app. It just lets me know that you're participating. It makes our prayer prompts, our daily prayer prompts available to you through your email. You'll receive a devotion every Wednesday leading up to Easter, and so just a little encouragement along the way. If you're not in the habit of making room for Jesus through a quiet time, a personal time of worship, jump in and start today. It doesn't matter if you start on day 1 of this reading plan or if you start on, I think we're ready for day 5. It's set up to take a break on Sundays and then read Monday through Saturday. Jump in tomorrow, day 5, day 1. It doesn't really matter where you begin. Just get started meeting with Jesus, making room for Him. If you're in the middle of your own reading plan right now, you're in the habit of having this quiet time with God. I'm so grateful for that, and we just want to encourage you in that too. I'd love for you to sign up still for this reading plan and just receive those daily prayer prompts in your email and pray along with the rest of us here at Wallula Christian Church. If you want to add these gospel readings to your plan, that'll take you through the Gospels leading up to Easter. That would be a great thing too. But just jumping in with those, adding those prayer times, those prayer prompts, and praying for those things every day would be a really meaningful contribution. Make room for Jesus every day. It means doing a few other things I think can help make room for Jesus as well. Here at Wallula Christian Church, we try to really concentrate on sort of 3 venues where we get together. All right, 3 places, doing 3 things, and this is what we want to do really well. I don't suppose we're always successful at that, but this is sort of where our focus is. And so we want to get together on Sunday mornings and worship together. We want to make worship together a priority. We want to gather in smaller groups to study God's Word and to pray together and to play together. And so our small groups are super important to us. Our ministry teams, we just had a ministry team fair and lunch, and sorry you missed the tacos last week if you weren't there, but they were pretty good. These ministry teams are opportunities for us to serve one another, our community, our God, and another opportunity for us to make room for Jesus. Those groups are always open, by the way. We're still signing up for those ministry teams especially. You can look on the Church Center app. There's some brochures in the foyer and at the Next Step station. If the Holy Spirit has been whispering to you, maybe you ought to get involved in this ministry and serve in this way, there's still time for you to jump in and be a part of those. We'd love for you to do that. Our small groups here at Wallula are always open, and so we'd love for you to be a part of one of those groups. And certainly make worship at Wallula a part of your weekend. Make room for Jesus. Maybe you're at a place where you're saying, Lance, I have too many questions about that stuff. I'm not sure what it looks like to have a daily time of worship on my own. What does that quiet time supposed to look like? Or maybe you're asking, I've never been a part of a small group. I kind of need a sense of what that is and where I can fit in and how I can get started. Or you've been thinking, I know I have this talent and God has shaped me in this way and I want to use it for His glory, but I've never been on a ministry team and I need a little encouragement to kind of take that courageous step. You can learn way more about that at our Explore Wallula class. Our next one is next Sunday evening at 5 o'clock, March 1st. We'll walk you through what it looks like to have a daily quiet time. We will share our small group information with you and answer any questions you have about those. We can help you learn how God has shaped you and gifted you and get you started in ministry teams. And so we'd love to have you for that. If you want to be a part of the next Explore Wallula, just mark on your welcome home card. There's a box at the bottom that says Explore Wallula. Check that box and that'll get you registered. Let us know your name and other information at the top. That would be beneficial, but that'll get you signed up. Make room for Jesus. Well, Jesus is at Simon's house. And he's evidently at the dinner party. He's reclining at the table when this woman, Matthew just says it's a woman who walks in. Another one of the gospel writers kind of fills in the gaps and lets us know that this woman was Jesus' friend Mary, that he's encountered before in Bethany. And Mary walks in. So this wouldn't have been unusual to this crowd. They probably would have known Mary. Her sister Martha was there, already busy serving dinner. And her brother Lazarus was reclined at the table with Jesus and His other disciples. And so Mary walks in, wouldn't have been unusual. She walks up to Jesus. She gets a little closer and a little closer, and maybe it's starting to get a little more unusual when she brings out this bottle of perfume. I think most people in the room would have recognized that this was a really special bottle of perfume. She was probably carrying it very carefully. It would have been recognized as potentially this family heirloom that was super important to Mary. And she walks up to Jesus and begins to anoint Jesus' head. This in and of itself wouldn't have been super unusual. Often honored guests were anointed with oil in someone's home, but here Mary is using this perfume, which is super expensive. That's a little weird. She starts to anoint Jesus' head, but not just with a little drip or a little dab. I sort of like to imagine, I don't think this is what happened, but I sort of like to imagine that she kind of tripped and just dumped the bottle onto Jesus' head. We know that way too much perfume was poured onto Jesus because it just cascades down His body. Again, the gospel writer John lets us know that Mary, again, not unusual to help maybe clean up a little bit, but she doesn't go for a servant's towel or a towel that she brings. She lets down her hair and wipes Jesus' feet with her own hair. I suppose it's at this point that someone in the room is thinking, awkward. Right? In fact, they start to talk to one another. What in the world is this lady doing? Why is she wasting all of that expensive perfume? Somebody who in the back of the room says, I don't like to judge, but he said, why don't we sell that? We could have used that proceeds, all those proceeds to help the poor. Jesus, knowing what they were thinking and saying, said only, why are you giving this lady so much trouble? She's done this beautiful thing for me. Jump in back in Matthew chapter 26 at verse 7. It says, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing for me. So Mary, this woman, we learned that from John chapter 12. If you want to go read this account in the Gospel of John, it's in chapter 12. And so we know that this woman is Mary, who brings in this alabaster jar of ointment, this perfume, and most scholars think that this perfume probably would have been worth about a year's wages. So it's really expensive perfume. It's really expensive ointment. And while it wouldn't be unusual to anoint somebody's head, maybe an honored guest, dumping perfume, something that expensive, would have been unusual. What's more, some scholars say that this was sort of like a family heirloom. Have you ever had a family heirloom that you're saving for a special occasion that never happens? Growing up with my folks in our house, we had a living room and a family room. And the living room was unusually named because it was a room with the good furniture in it, and nobody did any living in that room. This is the nice stuff that when we have guests, we'll bring them. And these special guests that we were saving this living room for never came. Well, I'm not sure if it was that kind of heirloom that Mary was carrying in. Lots of folks think that this was the sort of thing that she would have been saving for her marriage night. And so it was passed down through her family, and she was saving it. She'd bust out a little bit of this perfume on her honeymoon. So maybe this special event just sort of preempts the special event yet to come in her life. But in any event, as we get to step number 2 here, that we ought to worship Jesus extravagantly, man, Mary certainly does that. It wouldn't be unusual to anoint an honored guest, but she dumps the whole thing on his head. It wouldn't be unusual to help clean up that sort of mess, to maybe help him get ready for the rest of the night, but she uses her hair, not a towel, to wipe up the perfume, to wash his feet with her hair and perfume. She uses this entire jar, a year's worth of salary, in recognition of who Jesus is. Now, what does it look like in our life to worship Jesus in an extravagant way? I suppose, like Mary, it means that there's some kind of sacrifice is associated with our worship. Mary sacrificed this expensive perfume. She gave it up for Jesus. All of us, we made time. We got the kids ready. Right? We hustled to wake them up and to get them dressed, and we came in. It was colder than we wanted this morning. I would call all those things sort of small sacrifices, but sacrifices nonetheless. Worshiping Jesus requires some kind of sacrifice. I guess I would encourage you to think about, what does a Mary-sized, what does this Mary's extravagant worship sacrifice look like in my life? Well, she gave up this expensive perfume. Mary, I said there wouldn't have been unusual for her, especially Mary, to be there at this dinner party in the presence of Jesus, but she gets a little closer maybe than some folks thought was appropriate. She busts out this expensive perfume. Again, people would have been looking, okay, this is nice, and then she dumps it all on his head. By the way, I don't think she tripped. Right? That makes me giggle. but I think she absolutely meant to offer this sacrifice. You know, I just think that at some point we have to, when we worship Jesus, we can't be concerned about what people around us think. You know, maybe a few of you mentioned to a buddy this week, I think I'm going to go to church on Sunday. And he said, why? Or maybe some of you are thinking about being a part of a ministry team, and you've been having really hard conversations in your home because other folks that care about you are saying things like, do you really have time for this? Can you make this work? You know, at some point, those are hard conversations that are worth having. I'm not saying ignore the important people in your life, but at some point, we've got to decide, is Jesus worth, the effort? Step number 2 is to worship Jesus extravagantly. Well, Jesus continues this conversation with his disciples, and it's really at this point a rebuke of his disciples. He said, look, don't bother this lady. Don't bother Mary. She's done this beautiful thing for me. He said, the poor, they will always be with you. As these murmurs, this conversation has taken place, I don't know if Jesus heard them or if this was divine revelation. I think he's just reading the room. And he starts to explain, the poor will always be with you. It's not that Jesus doesn't care about them, but Jesus has in mind something bigger. And as his disciples are looking around and they're saying, come on, Jesus, what do you mean you won't always be with us? Probably some of them are saying things like, Jesus, just stop it. Don't be so dramatic, right? Chill out. And Jesus said, no, he fills in the gaps right away. He said, you know what she's done? She's used this perfume to prepare my body for burial. Would you look at verse 11 and 12 here in chapter 26 of Matthew? It says, for you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Step number 3 is to understand Jesus' one mission. I just want to call your attention to where Jesus is eating at right now. Whose house is he at? He's at this guy, Simon the leper. Right? I think probably Jesus has healed him at some point in the past, but this is a guy who had to walk through town before that interaction with Jesus shouting, unclean, unclean. Right? This is a guy that nobody wanted to hang out with. This is a guy that in other places in the book of Matthew is described as the least of these. I just want to remind all of us that Jesus really cares about the poor, the disenfranchised, the least of these. He would tell his disciples, man, I'm gonna tell you on the last day, on that judgment day, I'm going to say to some of you, well done, good and faithful servant, because when you saw me hungry, you fed me, and when you saw me naked, you gave me clothes. And they are asking Jesus, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you? Or when did we see you naked and offer you clothes? And Jesus will say, well, whenever you found that hungry person, when you encountered that poor guy that didn't have any place to stay and you worked at the shelter, when you helped that person out who the world says is the least of these, you've done that for me. Those actions, that displaying that kind of agape love to others is super important to Jesus. But let's not forget, I think is what Jesus is really saying to his disciples, why we're going through all that trouble. It's not only because those people have value, because they're created in the image of God. It's not only because that will help meet the needs of these individuals, but because it points to the love of Jesus. Because Jesus has this one mission. He's got this one job. He's saying, I was born to die. You go back a couple chapters in the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew chapter 16. There's another interaction that Jesus has with his disciples. He's again warning them that, hey, when we get to Jerusalem, some bad stuff is going to happen, and I'm going to die in Jerusalem. And one of his closest friends, Peter, one of his very, very closest friends, pulls Jesus aside. And he says, Jesus, stop talking like that. I will never let that happen to you. Do you know how Jesus responds? Do you know what Jesus says to Peter? This is the same guy, by the way, that when Jesus asked, who do people say I am? Peter responded, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And you know what Jesus said on that occasion? He said, it's that statement of faith. It's because you believe this, Peter, that I'll build my entire church. My kingdom will come because of this faith. And that same person, when Peter says, I will never let you die, Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Jesus has this one mission. Everything we do in service to Him, everything we do to benefit those around us is to show off the love of Christ, to remind the world, to illustrate for the world that there is a God who loves us so much that He sent His one and only Son into this world to teach and to minister, to preach and to heal, to die on a tree, and then to be buried in a tomb, but just for 3 days, because then He would raise from the dead, offering each and every one of us that same kind of resurrection, making room for each and every one of us on His team. Man, step number 3 is just to understand Jesus' one mission. He goes back to that rebuke of His disciples. He says, truly. I wonder if, when Jesus said truly, if it's one of those words that sort of triggered His disciples. I wonder if there were a few of them that when Jesus said truly, they sort of went, oh boy. You know, if somewhere in the back of the room somebody's rolling their eyes, because they know that rebuke, that preaching is just getting geared up when they hear truly. Something big is coming. Jesus said truly. Wherever this good news is shared, they'll tell this story of Mary as well. They'll share the story of this woman wherever this good news is shared. Verse 13 in Matthew chapter 26 says, truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Step number 4 is to leave a legacy of being with Jesus. A couple things stand out to me here in what Jesus said. You know, truly, you better pay attention when He says that. But then He said this gospel, wherever this gospel, the Greek word there means literally good news. It's the kind of announcement that when an army won a war, they would send somebody into town and they'd ride in and they'd say, rejoice, we won the battle. You maybe scroll through your social media and see what kinds of good news we share. You know, we might say, oh man, my kid won the spelling bee. I got a promotion at work. We got to go on vacation. I just bought a new car. All good news. But it sort of pales in comparison to the good news that Jesus is talking about. Now, it's odd that He would describe this story as good news, because what is He saying? Wherever people talk about my death, man, they're spreading good news. It's that one mission, folks. It's the fact that every single one of us is a sinner in desperate need of a Savior. Man, if you're in that boat with me, then it's good news that Jesus went to the cross. It's good news that He paid that price on our behalf. It's way better news that He didn't stay on that tree or in the grave, that on that third day He rose, and someday we'll experience that same kind of resurrection. And that is good news worth sharing. And this woman, Mary, she made a habit of it. She made a habit of staying close to Jesus. That's why she got into that little squabble with her sister a few years ago, because she was sitting listening to Jesus while Martha was doing all the cooking. It's why Mary is not shy about approaching Jesus on this occasion and dumping some perfume on His head. It's why Mary, when the rest of the disciples were hiding in fear of their life after Jesus' crucifixion, she shows up at the tomb. It's why she is one of the first women, one of the first people to see the resurrected Lord, and she becomes one of the very first evangelists. Because what does Jesus tell those women? And go and tell Peter and John and the rest of them. Go let them know that I'm raised from the dead. She shares that good news. Evangelist, same root word that comes from this gospel. The word we translate as good news. And Mary hung out with Jesus and she shared the difference that he made in her life. And that's what we ought to do. My very favorite verse in all the Scripture is Acts chapter 4, verse 13. By this time, I said Peter and John and the others were afraid after Jesus died. They were hiding out until Mary and some of the others came and said, you got to go meet Jesus. He's raised from the dead. And after they see Jesus, they are transformed. Peter is restored. And by this time, they are courageously speaking the truth and sharing that good news, getting themselves in hot water. Acts chapter 4, those religious leaders, they see the courage of Peter and John, and they take note that they are ordinary, unschooled men, but they are amazed. And they take note that they had been with Jesus. Man, it's my favorite verse because ordinary, unschooled, but I want to live a life that shows Jesus off, just like Mary. Just like Peter and John. I want to leave a legacy of being with Jesus. I want to stand out all the time for Jesus. You think about that Bonnaroo Music Festival. 70,000 people gathered, all kinds of reasons that people might stand out. It reminds me of one of my friends, one of our elders here at Wallula Christian Church, Bill Chris. Bill loves motorcycles. He's a part of the Christian Motorcycle Association. In a few weeks, he's going to tell you about his ride to the sun and how that benefits. And he goes to these motorcycle rallies in an environment and an atmosphere where all kinds of people are standing out for all kinds of reasons. He's trying to share the story of Jesus, he and his wife Vicky. I give Bill a little trouble because, he now his Harley is a trike, and we were at this fundraiser for Rehope a few days ago, and there was a trike on the silent auction, and as soon as I saw it, I thought about Bill, and I said, Bill, I found your new trike. You got to go bid on this. Well, another one of our friends, James Gallett, he bid on it and won this. But, so I guess Bill is going to stick with his Harley. I didn't hear Vicky, but he's going to stick with the Harley, and he's going to keep going to those rallies, and he's going to keep trying to share the story of Jesus, to stand out all the time for Jesus. And I want to be more like Mary. I want to be more like Peter and John. I want to be more like Bill. I want to stand out all the time for Jesus. Let's stand and worship Him.